Greetings of the day, everyone. I welcome you all to the last episode of FIC Charcha, a one-stop destination for all your business, finance, and most of all entertainment needs. This is a podcast series initiated by Finance and Investment Cell of Aryabhatta College, sponsored by Uniline Energy India and Delhi School of Communication. This is your host Madhumita Kumari, and I hope all of you are doing well. This is not one of those boring interviews that you watch on TV. This is going to be refreshing, entertaining, and full of information. So, without any further ado, let me introduce you to our last speaker of this podcast series, Mr Montek Singh Ahluwalia, sir, a Padma Vibhushan Awardee who did his graduation from St Stephen College and his post-graduation and doctoral from the prestigious Oxford University. A man of knowledge and the ex-deputy chairman of Planning Commission from 2004 to 2014. He is one of the top Indian economists of 21st century. In the episode, we will discuss about the current disinvestment plan of government and how capitalistic structure will be much more beneficial than the mixed structure we are following right now. Indian economy in the second wave, a potential third wave, development strategy during the effect and brain drain on the economy, and much more on this episode of FIC Charcha. Now, I would like to introduce Vikas Jagwan, an associate member of Finance and Investment Cell of Aryabhatta College, to start with the episode. So, grab a snack and enjoy this episode.
Good morning, sir. How are you?
Very well, thank you.
And sir, how has the COVID pandemic and the lockdown been for you?
Well, like everyone else, it's been very distressing. I'm fortunate that, I've escaped it so far. I hope all of you and your families are well. But quite obviously, it's affecting huge numbers of people. So we are really in the middle of quite an exceptional situation.
Yes, sir. Being a student in this pandemic, I myself am experiencing a bit of trouble. Sir, talking about the pandemic, I just have one question to ask to you. Sir, during the COVID-19 pandemic, India's economy fell off a cliff. We finished last year with a negative growth rate, and now with increasing COVID cases, black fungus, white fungus, are we experiencing a situation worse than last year? If so, what steps would you suggest that the government should take from now on to tackle this situation more efficiently?
Well, when you say, are we facing a situation worse than last year? Until very recently, that was not the expectation. The second surge has really been massive. There is some evidence that it has peaked and it looks as if it's coming down. But what I don't know is how the government intends to handle it this time. If there is a series of lockdowns, then definitely the assumption that the economy would recover will need to be revisited. At one stage, there were people saying that, yes, it's been bad in 2020, but we will experience a V-shaped recovery. That turned out actually to be a little too optimistic anyway. And it's difficult. What is happening right now is that whereas earlier people were projecting that following a decline of 8% of GDP in the year 2021, we might experience a kind of, RBI said 10.5% growth in the current year. Time assumed it might be 11%. Most people are now shading that downwards. And, we don't have any official estimate, and probably we won't until June. But if you go by the financial analysts, most of them think that the economy will simply recover from the base level of last year and maybe go back to the same level of GDP in 2009-10. But this is based on the assumption that there won't be any extensive lockdowns. If it turns out that in order to manage the pandemic, either the central government or the state governments are pushed to do a lot more locking down, then you could have a worse outcome. But, there's uncertainty. At the moment, we just have to keep our fingers crossed and hope for the best. On the issue of what to do, the most important thing is to put in place a very clear strategy for managing the pandemic. I don't think it makes a lot of sense to focus too much on economic strategy without being clear what is our strategy for managing the pandemic. Because, the pandemic, it doesn't just mean that it obviously creates a lot of unhappiness and pain, but it also generates a huge amount of uncertainty. So right now, I think almost everybody is agreed that the most important thing that the government can do is to expand the vaccination process and cover as many people as possible. Now, they're running into problems because of supply, et cetera, but that's a separate issue. And how to handle that is an open question. But to my mind, I think at this point, putting in place a sensible health strategy makes a lot of sense. If the second wave is beginning to recede, we should anticipate that we may have a third wave and make sure that we don't get caught napping, which we were in the case of the second wave, which also means that logistically, a lot of the preparation that was done for the second wave should not be quickly undone. And certainly stocking of essential commodities, essential medical supplies, etc., should be maintained in case we go back to a shortage situation. And we need a much bigger ramping up of vaccination.
Yes, sir. Sir, regarding this, I have a question regarding vaccination. Do you believe that in a country with income disparity, we are facing a situation where the more rich class or affluent class of the society have better access to the vaccination, or is it same for every class?
Question of vaccination being free. I do believe that vaccination should be available free to everybody. But you have to work out what does that actually mean, because you could have a central government window which provides free vaccinations. We have a large number of vaccines available. They may not be all immediately available, but they will soon become available. Some of them will be more expensive than the others. Now, if the government is going to provide vaccinations free, I think we should have a system in which those who cannot afford it get it free through a government source, but those who can pay and get it through a private source. And it is true that those who are more informed and maybe higher income will rush to get themselves vaccinated. But that is itself not a bad thing, because whoever is vaccinated, the benefit goes to everybody because the percentage vaccinated increases. I think the other point is that there are some of the new vaccines are much more expensive. I don't think it makes sense for the government to be paying for expensive vaccines and giving them away free when you have cheaper vaccines available. So I think what we should have is a government system that procures a number of lower priced vaccines and make them available free. Make it possible for everybody who wants to get a higher priced vaccine that will also be available.
Yes, so I do agree that.
I had written a piece in Mint way back in December, in which I had said that, look, we should create a window where the market can also work. And the government should take up X% of the total production. What I had said was that, look, for the next 6 months or so, or 3 months or so, we should continue with the present system. That is, the government should buy all the vaccines and make them available. But after that, we should make the provision to have a window for the market. So the government takes up only 60% of the production and the rest is available for the market. Now, if a vaccine is high priced, the government may not want to take up that 60%, so they can let that go into the market too. So there are ways of structuring it which would have achieved the objective of keeping a free window open for everybody, but also allowing others to access vaccines which are more expensive. And some people might say that that creates a differential. because rich people can get better vaccines. But that's true of our health system. I mean, if you're a rich person, you get a much better hospital treatment. If you're a poor person, you get a bare minimum. I think the strategy should be that we should assure the minimum, but people who want the more expensive option should be allowed to pay for it.
Yes, sir. So also I do believe
that would also apply to imported vaccines.
So also I do believe that every vaccine has like almost the same efficacy rate. So it doesn't affect the market much if like the richer people are getting a better vaccine, because there's only a difference of 5 to 10% in the efficacy rate. So yeah, that thing is indeed true, that rich people, like people who can pay the vaccine, should pay for it.
Let me clarify, by the way, if
Yes,
a rich person wants to have the free vaccine, you should be allowed to have. I'm not saying that you should say you are rich, you don't get the free vaccine.
Yes.
You should say that, look, anybody can get the free vaccine, but we know that 10, 15% of the population will not turn up for the free vaccine if they can get what they think is a somewhat better facility, less crowding, greater flexibility in fixing appointments, etc., etc.
Yes, sir. I agree. Okay, so sir, that was very, very nice of you to clarify that point. So sir, coming to the next question, and as I said, this question is really close to my heart. I have like asked my economic teacher this question, and I like wanted to ask you this question. So the question is, India's population is among the youngest in the world. India's median age gap is expected to be 28 years in the year 2022. So according to you, what steps need to be taken on a priority basis in order to exploit the opportunity for the country's development? And since we are experiencing a situation of brain drain, where people of our country expect to work, or like are more preferring to work in a foreign country, do you think that any expenditure in this sector would only ignite the fire of brain drain?
Sorry, in which sector?
So the educational sector.
Let me say that there's no question that we have the youngest population in the world, and our population is actually growing. So our labor force will be growing. So in one sense, that is a positive factor, because labor is an input into production and it enables you to produce more. But that will only happen if other policies are conducive to expanding production. If the other policies are not conducive to getting a high growth, then I think this large labor force will just not be a benefit. So I think the most important thing we have to realize is that if you want our younger people to have more jobs, we should aim at a much faster rate of growth than we are achieving. A lot of people tend to make this mistake of saying the objective should not be growth, but it should be jobs. That's wrong in my view. Because if you don't grow, you will not generate jobs. Take it from me. But it's not enough to say growth. Not every growth process generates the jobs you want. So you need growth in those sectors that are potentially job creating. But you need growth. If you give up on growth and just try to distribute existing jobs around, you will be in an awful position, and you will generate a huge amount of frustration on the part of the youth. So you need high growth, and everything that's necessary to get high growth needs to be done. But in addition, you want to make sure that this high growth occurs in those areas that actually absorb a lot of labor. I mean, let me just exemplify. Mining does not absorb a lot of labor. So if you have a high growth strategy based on extracting minerals, you do need to extract minerals if you want to use them. But if you have a high growth strategy based entirely on extracting minerals and exporting them, you're not going to generate very much employment. On the other hand, if you have a high growth strategy based on expansion of manufacturing in a competitive manner, using the manufacturing base to export abroad, link up with global supply chains, because remember, the world has become much, much more integrated, then you will create higher and higher quality jobs. That's what we did for many years. I mean, after all, new kinds of jobs in software and even back business processing offices, etc. All of this came 15 years ago, led to a great expansion of jobs. So it was a growth in a sector that was job creating. That's what we need to do now. So whenever somebody says, what do you need to do? A, you need to get your growth strategy right. B, you need to make sure that the young people have the skills needed to support this growth strategy. So this is really where education comes in. And education is not just skills and training, it's also basic education. We have huge problems there. And I can go into them if you want. But it's these two things that we have to operate on simultaneously. Simply getting kids educated, but creating an environment in which jobs are not produced is not going to help anybody.
So, sir, I think that the point that you mentioned, that simply creating, spending on education and not creating jobs, I think that it's because of this that we are experiencing a situation of brain drain. Like in my own surroundings, I've seen people looking to go for foreign universities and go for foreign jobs rather than like work out something in their own country. So, do you believe that there is a problem in the Indian youth to go outside India, or do you believe that it's the government's fault to not offer a much better job environment here?
No, look, let me put it this way. Indian youth cannot solve their problem by emigrating because countries will not allow you to emigrate. So the notion that one option is that all our youth will go abroad, that's simply not an option. What will happen is that the best Indians will get jobs abroad. And this is another interesting point. Obviously, in the rest of the world, if you are the kind of engineer who belongs in the top 1% of the global resource pool, you will get a job anywhere, okay? Should we object to that? I don't think so. Because we have enough people. We should be generating more and more engineers so that we have enough for ourselves. And some of the better ones can also go abroad. That creates a global linkage for us. They go abroad, they improve the image of Indians. Maybe when they are locating, they're in those companies, they're locating investments abroad. They say, listen, why don't you go to India? And the guys say, look, these Indians are smart, why don't we go there? So I think we should not be stopping anybody from going abroad. We have to solve the problem domestically. I mean, there are two separate issues here. One is job creation. There are a lot of people who will prefer to go abroad, even if they want to come back, because they think a foreign degree will make them more attractive, even for Indian job hunters. I mean, for employee hunters. I mean, really, the economy has a capacity to grow. And as long as it's able to feed that capacity with the internal talent, there is some talent that is internationally competitive, it should be allowed to go abroad. It's good for us.
Yes, sir. Sir, talking about the point of Indian economy, sir, India is gradually experiencing a shift towards a more capitalist economy. So do you believe that active privatization of many government sectors that we are seeing is healthy for an economy with huge income disparity? If so, will this shift towards capitalization going to have a trickle-down effect?
Well, let me be very categorical on this. I am firmly of the view that the big change that was made in 1991 was that the earlier approach of giving an excessive preference for the public sector was wrong, that the Indian private sector has now come of age. We should give them the flexibility to operate. They will be more efficient than the public sector and the economy will do well. The effect of those reforms validates that conclusion. So I don't think we should feel that that's a failure. The fact that we have a dynamic private sector is a strength. And I'm not in favor of going back to the old socialist world in which you prevented private capital from expanding, putting licensing restrictions and putting everything in the public sector. I mean, a good example of that in a very competitive world is telecommunications. I mean, we opened up telecommunications to the private sector in 1993. Lots of people came in. There was a lot of shakeout. Some guys went out. There were even problems of allegations of corruption and so on. You know, when you make big changes, everybody tries to do whatever they can, and some people are maybe not very principled and do things unfairly. But if you look at what happened in telecom as a whole, it is without doubt an outstanding success. And now you have a sector which is an outstanding success, and within it, the performance of the public sector is lousy. I mean, MTNL and BSNL have simply not been able to take up all these expanding possibilities, even though they were given a spectrum on a preferential basis. So let's be very clear about it. If you want to go back, to hold back the private sector, I disagree with you. However, let me say that the concern about crony capitalism and monopoly capitalism is absolutely correct. The only way in which private capital can be made acceptable is if it's transparent, if fresh entry is freely allowed, and I would even say global entry is freely allowed. I mean, I don't think we don't need 20 telecom companies. Maybe we need 2 or 3. But I don't see anything wrong with one of those being international, because it's only a big international player that will be able to compete against some of our bigger Indian players. So crony capitalism has to be taken care of by transparency and competition. And competition actually means giving the consumer the choice between domestic production or foreign production. So if you can create a climate where we don't get locked into this perception that inequality has increased, therefore, private enterprise is bad. I mean, I think that's just completely wrong. And it is not the case, in my view, that the increase, that all that has happened is that inequality has increased. Inequality is increasing everywhere, not just in India. It's happening in the US, it's happening in China, it's happening. So the question is, if we think the US is a successful society, if we think China is a successful society, then I think in both those countries, inequality has increased. I don't think that we should do something about reducing our inequality, better taxation, doing more for the poor, making sure that there's trickle down. Those are all very important things. But let me say in the Indian context, I mean, there was a lot of doubt whether the liberalization and the extensive freedom given to the private sector would actually lead to the rich becoming richer and the poor becoming poorer. This is not correct. It is true that the rich have become richer, but the poor have become much less poor, except in the last 2 years, poverty has been steadily going down in India. So I think this particular misconception needs to be addressed upfront. And I mean, I'm not saying that I'm right, but if you disagree with me, you should actually say so. And then we should have a discussion. What is it that you really believe?
So I believe that the financial sector, the privatization of financial sector that the government is thinking will affect the poor sector in a bad way, because I think that the concession that the public financial banks give will not be available if they are privatized. A, and B, I think that the rich are becoming richer and the poor are becoming poorer. Can
I hold you back? Please hold me. Yes, let me interrupt you.
Yeah, no problem.
In the last 2 years, it's absolutely true that the poor have become poorer. But in the last year, GDP growth went down by 8%. And just as when the GDP goes up, the poor benefit, but the rich benefit more. When the GDP goes down, the poor are hurt much more. So there's no doubt in my mind that after 1920, poverty increased sharply. But are you saying that from 2004 to 2007, the last survey, I think the last survey that was actually published on the consumer index was 2011-12.
Yes, sir.
It's unambiguously true that poverty went down. So the proposition that the poor became poorer is just factually wrong. That is true of the last 2 years. Now, the last 2 years are years of the pandemic. You could say that the pandemic wasn't handled as well as it should have been, but probably even if it had been handled as well as it should have been, poverty would have increased. So I'm not talking about the last 2 years. But please don't confuse what happened in the last 2 years with the general direction. Now let me come to the public sector.
Yes, sir. Sir, I do agree that...
I do not accept your proposition that if we were to privatize banking, particularly expanding fintechs and MFIs and so on, I don't think it's true that the poor would be worse off. You could have a structure of private banking where credit is expanding, The banks lend money to what I call microfinance institutions, and they lend to the poor. And I mean, this is a proposition that is worth going into in some detail. Remember, we have 70% of our public sector banks, or now it's less, but for a long time it has been 70%, have been in the public sector. It's the highest percentage in the whole world. And yet, during this period, a lot of you think that the poor didn't get any benefits. I think that after 2004, poverty went down, and the importance of public sector banking went down, and private sector banks expanded. So I don't agree with this at all.
Oh, sir,
I
think that
please don't agree with me just because you have become older.
Mhm.
I welcome a proposition saying that this guy honestly thinks this and he's absolutely wrong. I accept that.
Mhm.
But you need to ask yourself the question that does a form of lazy banking where government pressure on public sector banks leads to the bulk of the money going to all kinds of crony capitalists who invest it in highly capital intensive projects, and you do a little bit of token lending for the poor. Is that better than efficient lending, which supports dynamic growth of industry, which generates a lot of jobs?
Mhm.
You know?
Yes, sir. I am in a dilemma here because I believe that you said that private sector banks have been growing at a much higher pace, but I believe that it's due to their capitalistic structure. But I do agree to the point that public sector banks are indulged in a cycle of rowdy capitalism where like there's less lending to the poor, and like it's a very bad cycle. But I would like to like present my point that in public, like as long as it is public, it will look out for it will look out for public interest. The
By the
moment
way,
it
that's
goes private.
completely wrong. I totally disagree with you there. The notion that because the bank is public sector, if a bank is public sector, it will look after what the finance ministry tells it to look after. And the notion that the finance ministry is watchful of all these things is completely wrong. So look, you guys are in the financial investment area. So this is a very serious matter for all of you. And I'm quite happy to have a separate session with you on this issue. But almost all financial experts, I mean, you make a list of your own financial experts that you think are experts. I mean, Urjit Patel, Viral Acharya, you name it. I don't think they're talking about wholesale privatization. Do they support the idea that private sector banks should be allowed to expand and that both private sector banks and public sector banks should be put on a level playing field? Do they agree with this or no? If they agree with this, and you were to do that, and the private sector banks expanded and the public sector banks didn't, would you regard that as a good thing or a bad thing? Would you regard the overall banking system as becoming more efficient or not? And my view is that the poor are not helped by an inefficient banking system. The usual way of judging a banking system's efficiency is actually its net non-performing assets. Judged on that framework, your public sector banks are 3 or 4 times worse than the private sector banks. And they're all controlled by the government. And the government, and I'm not complaining about the present government, this is for the last 30 years. When the government controls the banks, it never takes responsibility for the end result. It only asks questions, writes letters saying, why aren't you doing more? Why aren't you doing less, etc., etc. So quite frankly, I think we need to bring in a lot more competition into the system and make the banking system more efficient than it is. It's not.
Yes, sir. I do agree to the point of NPAs that the public sector NPAs are bad are like worse than the private sectors. So yes, I do agree to this point.
Not worse. 3 to 4 times worse.
4 times worse. Yes, sir.
I mean, that's horrendous.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. Yes, sir. So, sir, that's it for my questions. Now it's time for Uniline Power Question of the Week, and this question is asked by Shiv Patel. So, sir, the question goes: You were the youngest division chief in the World Bank bureaucracy. Tell us something about your experience at the World Bank, and since you were there at a very early phase of your life, how did it further help to shape your career?
You know, that's a very difficult question to answer because whatever you do at a young stage in your life, when you look back on it at the age of 77, it looks like a great experience because you can't separate it out from being young and new, etc. So I thoroughly enjoyed what I did. I joined the bank, of course, because it was a very attractive career. But I basically also felt that I wanted to make some money abroad and then come back to India. And I didn't want to join the private sector because I always wanted to work in public policy. And the World Bank enabled me to work in public policy dealing with other developing countries. So I dealt with a lot of developing countries, and it gave me a good sense of how other countries think on the kinds of problems, similar problems to the ones that we had. And I thought it was very enjoyable. In fact, increasingly for young people, I mean, having multiple experiences is a good idea. I mean, when I was your age, I mean, my parents would have said, find a good place, go there and work your way to the top. This is actually not what I would recommend today to people. It's much better to experiment. And by the time you're 45, if you're applying for a job, you should be able to say you've done 3 different things. Now, this requires a bit of guts. It requires taking a risk. But the net result is that you become much more aware of the real world and the nature of real world challenges in a different environment. Whereas if you just stick in one company, you're just locked into a bureaucracy, one single bureaucracy, and that's not very good.
So, sir, was it your risk-taking attitude or your patriotism towards your country, or was it the opportunity you saw in your country that made you come back to Indian bureaucratic sector, or was it something else?
Well, no, you know, in my case, I wanted to work on advising government on economic policy, and you can only advise your own government. I mean, in the World Bank, you run around, you give some advice to governments, they take it, they don't take it. I mean, it's a somewhat, it's a peripheral activity. Maybe useful to the people inside who want to use your inputs in making their own decisions. But you're not a participant in decision making. So in my case, I mean, there was no alternative. I mean, if I wanted to have an impact on policy, the only way I could do that is by coming back to India, which is what I did.
Okay, sir. Okay. So, sir, in the 1991 reforms, you were like very actively enthusiastic about it. So, is it the same enthusiasm you have? Like we were talking about the privatization right now. So, is it the same enthusiasm you have right now towards the privatization, or is it a somewhat kind of mixed strategy? And like that was a different opportunity, or that was a different scenario than what we have right now?
No, I think, let me say that 1991 was a very straightforward case. We were the most controlled economy in the world, other than the communist countries. So in my view, it was a no-brainer. We were not socially and politically a genuinely communist country or a socialist country. We were a country that had lots and lots of private sector, and we were crippling our private sector and not allowing them to expand. And that seemed to me to be quite stupid. So it was very clear to me that's where we should go. And I've said some of that in my book, Backstage. I don't know if you've seen it, but I do advise those of you who are interested to look at it. I mean, it took a long time, and I wasn't the only person. I had a sense that many, many people in the government, particularly younger people, shared these views, and we were able to work together and slowly get changes made. Even the senior people, I think, understood that change was necessary. But it took a long time because, after all, we are a democracy, and you cannot do things very suddenly in democracy. So I would say in 1980s, some baby steps were taken towards economic reforms, but nobody had the courage to say this system is no good. In 1991, that's the time when, under Prime Minister Narasimha Rao, with Manmohan Singh as finance minister, actually changed the system. They said, okay, open up to the world. All this nonsense about restricting foreign investment is wrong. The private sector restraints through industrial licensing is wrong. Import control through licensing is wrong. Let's use the exchange rate and make it more flexible. A whole different set of reforms, including the start of reforms in the banking. Although that was a very modest start. So we were aware that we weren't doing everything. There are many things we should have done, which I would have hoped we had done faster. I mean, like in my view, what we did in 20 years, between 1991 and 2001, in 2000, say from 1991 to 2020, that entire chain, I think it should have been done not in 20 years, but it should have been done that's 30 years, 2020. It should have been done in half the time. We should have moved much faster. But politically, whether anybody would have been able to generate that consensus is an open question. But the important thing to learn is that what has worked. I mean, your generation should have absolutely no doubt whatsoever that getting rid of these restrictions on the private sector was right, and those restrictions were criminal. You know, Rahul Bajaj used to go around in world meetings and make these very amusing remarks that I'm the only industrialist who, if I increase production by 20%, I could go to jail because they put a licensing limit on how many scooters. Although there was a 10-year wait for a Bajaj scooter. I mean, that was just, the government was being stupid. Now, I think that doesn't mean that therefore everything is right today. You're right to say that, look, how has the world changed? I think the world has changed in the sense that now we have a lot of private sector companies that are quite substantial. Many of them are competing with each other, and you see that in telecom, for example. But more of them need to compete abroad. Given the importance and size of India, our presence in the global supply chain is negligible. And China has demonstrated what is possible. I mean, they swept the world market for low-skill manufacturing goods, and as a result, generated a phenomenal range of employment in China, which helped them to bring people out of agriculture. We have not done that. And that is, in my view, a major failure. Many reasons for it. First of all, we were a bit slow in making some changes. I mean, for example, most of the simpler manufacturers in India were subject to small-scale reservation. And it was a huge mistake, because we should have de-reserved all this so efficient companies could have expanded. And only when you're a large enough scale can you enter world markets. Many manufacturers who came to India would say that, look, we can't find anyone who can guarantee us a certain amount of production in the short time that we want, because they just don't have the scale. And that is entirely because we did not de-reserve. We finally have. But it took 12 years to get rid of small-scale reservation, which was ridiculous. We should have done it in 5 years, in my view. Okay. What is happening now? China is moving out of these simple manufacturers into much higher end things. I mean, they're competing with America in front end technology. They're not producing pots and pans, or maybe they are, but we could compete against them on that. What's actually happening is that their share is being taken by Bangladesh and Vietnam. And then if you ask in India, why is it so? Well, they will tell you, we will tell you that first of all, our infrastructure is bad. Secondly, we overprice power for industry because we want to give subsidies to certain categories of people, and also because the discoms don't collect their bills from ordinary people and overcharge industry. So power is uncompetitive. We don't have good infrastructure because we're not investing enough in quality infrastructure, because our procedures of customs clearance are grossly outdated. Now, all these things are changing, but they're changing too slowly. I think this effort being made in the last few years, it started even before the present government, and this government has emphasized it, which is good, ease of doing business. There's some progress. But, on many areas like resolution of commercial disputes, we are a disaster. How long does it take to get permission for construction? We are a disaster. These are not necessarily central government things. These are state government matters. So frankly, I think that we ought to hold a competitive lens before us and say, look, where are we compared to these guys? Why is it that in Vietnam, it takes 2 days to get a permission, whereas in India, it takes 15? Maybe earlier. It's no good saying earlier it used to take 2 months, because everybody has improved. The real point is we are still much worse than our alternatives. And I think we need to do that much faster. Now, some of this is not something that the central government can do. Some of this is something the state governments have to do. So state governments should compete with each other. But some things can only be done by the central government, and certainly major infrastructure development can only be done by them. Now there, for example, the privatization of ports, which was started in 2004, is a great success. I mean, there are lots of good private sector ports, and it's amazing that it took so long to realize that by controlling the ports, the government wasn't adding any value. It was just grabbing some jobs for itself or its civil servants.
Yes, sir. Sir, I totally agree to that. And I think that it's just a fact that now that we look at it, it seems quite simple. But at that time, like the huge criticism and the difficulty of the matter that like forced them into like taking so much time to fix the situation. But yeah, I totally agree that this should have been done faster than than our neighboring country China, because we both got independence at the same time. And look at the difference right now.
No, my point is that as people interested in pushing government, you should ask these questions wherever you are, whichever state you are. Saying, look, what are you doing on this? Unfortunately, too much of our politics depends on freebies, getting something free. And it's only people like yourselves who are at the cutting edge of education who can create an environment in which people realize that, you know, when a state government gives something for free, what it really means is it doesn't invest in infrastructure. And the net result is you get less jobs. But I don't think we've created a political pressure on politicians which makes them answer those questions. They still believe that if they can give freebies, they can get re-elected. I mean, I'm not against freebies. If somebody says, I'm going to generate 8% growth and give you freebies, that's fine. But the truth is, when you give freebies, you actually give up growth.
Yes, sir. Okay. So, sir, that is it. That was it for the Uniline Power Question of the Week. Now let's move to DSC Rapid Fire round. In this round, sir, you will just get 10 seconds to answer a question, and please answer it fast. So, sir, my first question is: if not an economist, what would you have been?
Probably a journalist.
Okay. So, describe your college life in 3 to 4 words.
My what?
Your college life in 3 to 4 words.
Oh, very exciting. Look, I'm 77 years old, and when I look back on what life was like when I was 19, it looks very exciting. Everybody should say that their college life was very exciting.
But sir, our college life is being spent on Google Meet and Zoom.
I agree with you, by the way. I think COVID has really done immense damage. I mean, there's no way that a young person today will look back on his college life with any of the kind of positive vibes that we associate with. But that's unfortunate. Really, I sympathize with you, and it's a big loss.
Okay, sir. What would be the first thing you would do if you were the finance minister right now?
That's a tough question, but I would reform the GST. I mean, look, there are many things that have to be done, but the finance ministry has limited areas of control. So in my view, the biggest thing for her should be to implement a system of tax reform over a 5-year period, because I think we are not raising nearly as much taxes as we should. And within that, the most important thing is to modernize and clean up the GST. It's there, and I mean, it's been amply discussed. I believe they have a meeting in a couple of days, so let's see what they do.
Yes, sir. Sir, what would be the first thing you would do if you were the health minister right now?
Totally revamp the vaccine strategy and lay out a very clear target. What is the targeted access to vaccines that I'm planning? You could have an optimistic target and a realistic target. and then complete transparency on having got these vaccines, how are they going to actually be distributed? I think that would be the single most important thing to do at the moment.
Sir, one word to describe Mr. Narendra Modi.
He's a very compelling speaker.
Yes, sir. So one word to describe your book, Backstage.
Sorry, my book?
Yes, sir.
Well, it's a very long book, so it's not fair to ask me. Let's just say it should be of interest to your generation to read, so that you don't fall into the mistakes that we took some time to correct.
Okay, sir. So, sir, that's it for the DSC rapid fire question. Yes, sir. Sir, now let's move on to the picture round. So, sir, this is the first picture.
Yep.
So you have to describe the picture in around 1 to 3 sentences.
Well, I don't know where the picture was actually taken, but it obviously some discussion going on with the finance minister, with Dr. Montek Singh when he was finance minister, and Rangarajan, who was then the governor of the RBI.
Yes, sir. Sir, let's move on to the next picture.
That is a picture taken in Delhi when President Obama visited in the Prime Minister's residence. And there was a long line of us, and we were all greeting him one after the other. I can see that Kapil Sibal is right next to me.
So did you get to talk to him, or was it just a handshake?
He says a couple of words, you say a couple of words, but not really what you would call talking.
Okay, sir. Okay. So this is the next picture.
Well, that's clearly in the finance ministry when Dr. Montek Singh was finance minister and I was finance secretary. I don't know exactly what the occasion was, but he used to meet with people a lot and hear their views. And very often he would explain. I mean, we would do a lot of the explaining, but he would also himself explain government policy. And clearly right now, he's doing that.
Yes, sir. So there are a lot of photos of you and Dr. Montek Singh. Were you guys close together, or was it just your bureaucratic time as in the finance ministry?
No, clearly we were. I mean, I worked under him for the entire 5-year period of the Narasimha Rao government, and subsequently, when he called me back to become deputy chairman of the Planning Commission, I used to meet him frequently. Because he had made me a special invitee to the cabinet, so I used to attend every cabinet and most of the cabinet committee meetings. But I also knew him personally, so there was a personal angle to it. But most of the official photos that you see are really photos which are discussing official things, not personal things.
Okay, sir. So that's it. That's it for the questioning round. That's it for the interview.
Good.
I was really glad to have you here.
I hope you have enjoyed our last episode of FIC Charcha with Mr. Montek Singh Aluhwalia, sir. Now, I would like to end this series by thanking all our speakers who have enlightened us with their wisdom, our interviewers and hosts for their hard work, and last but not the least, our audience for truly making this podcast series a success and showering so much love and warmth to each episode. I hope you all have learned something each speaker and you were inspired and motivated through their journey. Now, it's time to bid adieu as we are ending this series here. We will meet you next time. Till then, stay healthy, stay safe. This is your host Madhumita Kumari signing off.